way to start up the conversation. So first off, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Michael Larsen. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter at MKLTesthead. And I've been a software tester and working both directly and peripherally around software testing roles for the past, I would say 27 years or so. I started in 1991 when I first started working at what was then a very little company called Cisco Systems. And I've worked for a number of organizations since then. At this point in time, as I said, I've been primarily a software tester. I've worked in a number of other realms. At the moment, I'm a Scrum Master and a Build Manager in addition to being a software tester. And in all three of those areas, accessibility and inclusive design are important elements to it. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So when we talk about accessibility and inclusive design, they are similar, but they're a little bit different as well. And I'll give some examples of those similarities and differences. So when we talk about accessibility, the proper definition of it is the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people with disabilities. Accessibility allows for design compatibility with a person's assistive technology. So the key in that is that last sentence. Accessibility is making products so that they can work with additional technology to help overcome or deal with the particular disability that a person is primarily dealing with. Inclusive design has a similar goal, but it does it differently. The design of mainstream products and or services that are accessible to and usable by as many people as possible without the need for special adaptation or specialized design. So while accessibility focuses on being able to interact with additional technology, inclusive design does its very best to try to accommodate those differences without necessarily having to use additional technology. So why should we care about this? Well, nearly 1 in 5 people has some form of disability. And if you're lucky enough to live long enough, you're going to deal with something down the road. It's a guarantee. Many people not considered disabled have some form of disability, even if it is simply wearing glasses. For many people, what we like to call the gift that keeps on giving shows up around age 45. If you've worn glasses for periods prior to this in your life, it's something that you've gotten used to for various reasons or for various conditions. But for most adults, the age of 45 is a telling period of time because that's when you get to pick up a pair of these. These are reading glasses, and I need them most of the time. Prior to the age of 45, I didn't need them. And that was my first taste into the need to adapt so that I could do my everyday work, where in situations before, it felt just very normal. And that's one of the challenges that we face when we talk about accessibility and inclusive design and disabilities, is that products are made by people like us, the royal us here, who think like us, who live like us, who behave and act like us, and who have our capabilities. So depending upon the group you get together, it's entirely possible that your organization may not have a single person on its team that is dealing with any type of disability, whether it be vision, hearing, cognitive, etc. And if that is the case, then you may have a lot of implicit biases in the way that you are developing your software that you may think works perfectly fine, but on the flip side is less useful to those who have these issues, and you're not even aware of it because you don't think about it. And again, that you is global. I'm not pointing out to one individual saying that. I can just as easily say, that's how I felt before these entered my reality. By the way, for those who are at all curious as to why all of a sudden we tend to need reading glasses at age 45, it's because of a situation. It's because of a situation where your eyes, the actual vitreous humor, and the supporting structure around it, hardens with age. So it's very pliable when you're younger, and so it's like a camera with a moving depth of field. As you get older, your eyes harden and your depth of field shrinks. And at some point, it shrinks to the point to where text in front of you that is less than a certain size or contrast is difficult to read. I am okay with anything that is farther away than my arm's length, but anything within that, I struggle to look at. And the last point with this that I want to go with is design taken for granted one day, as I said, may be insufficient the next. So there are two different types of disabilities that are worth discussing here. The first one is what we call primary disability. So my example here with a need to wear reading glasses, it's a primary disability in the sense that without them, I struggle to do something, and it's not going to go away. So if you have low vision, low hearing, limited mobility, or you have a cognitive disability that is always there, that's a primary disability. But just as important is what we call situational or secondary or situational disabilities. And that's where you may find yourself in a situation to where you are perhaps momentarily disabled. One of my favorite examples of this is, let's imagine that you're at a concert, rock concert, you're in the middle of the crowd, 120 decibel sound system is blaring, and you get a phone call. Well, what are you going to do in that moment when you try to answer that call? Do you actually think you're going to be able to hear the person on the other end? Probably not very well. And so that interaction is hampered. And it's hampered because you are dealing with a situational disability. Now, of course, you could pick yourself up and walk out of the concert and get out of the room and find yourself in a quieter place and then have that conversation, which again points to the situational nature. If you find yourself in a situation where you cannot perform to your optimal ability, you may very well discover that the solutions you take for granted most of the time suddenly stop working for you. And that's every bit as frustrating as working with a primary disability, with one exception. Situational disabilities, by their very definition, are transient. They can go away. Primary disabilities don't. So again, some examples of situational disabilities are background noise or hearing, distracted tasking. If you have to deal with a bunch of situations at the same time, you can face cognitive overload. So small text on non-scaled web pages inside of a mobile device, great example of vision not helping, especially if you have to struggle to see what's there. And foreign language. I will admit that I've had situations where I've landed in airports across the world and I've walked out and I've tried looking at signs and I've had no idea what I was looking at. And I had to look around and figure out or talk to somebody to figure out what I had to do until I found a sign that was posted in English. And then I could actually respond to it. So every one of us can find ourselves in one of these situations. Okay. So here's one of my favorite examples of inclusive design in action. Many people who have either had the pleasure or the frustration, depends on your personal view, of IKEA products. It's possible some of you have struggled with putting IKEA furniture together at some point in time. I myself have been in that situation. I freely admit it. But IKEA does something very, very well, and that is their instructions. What you will notice if you take a look at an IKEA instruction sheet, usually, with very few exceptions, what you get is one small collection of instructions. There are almost no words associated with it. there are a few numbers, but everything else is done in pictures. That is by design. And the reason it is done that way is so that they don't have to print 60 or 70 different user manuals that are specific to any one country. They can ship their product anywhere. And for the most part, by doing so, any country, any language can take the one page or the small booklet as is, and they can use it immediately. If IKEA were to put words and descriptive text with all of their instructions, they'd have to do it for all of the markets that they sell in. And that would mean that they would have these large instruction manual books that waste a lot of paper. So again, whether or not you have a personal opinion about IKEA and the way that they do what they do, when it comes to their instructions, IKEA gets inclusive design. So in 2007, there was a book written by Alexander Siddick about making accessible websites. And the centerpiece of that book was the 10 principles of accessibility. And I want to give a shout out to Alexander Siddick for this right now, because these 10 principles were what he wrote in his book, and I have used them for just about every talk that I give whenever I discuss accessibility. And I think that these principles are very valuable, and I want to make sure that other people are aware of them. And so, but I want to make sure that he gets his credit. I've also got a listing for references at the end of these slides. So number one is to avoid making assumptions about the physical, mental, and sensory abilities of your users whenever possible. I feel that's pretty self-explanatory, but you have to understand that what you think might be reality may not even be close to it. When in doubt, ask and find out. Number two, your users' technologies are capable of sending and receiving text. That is about all you'll ever be able to assume. There's lots of products out there. There's lots of features and capabilities. And so it's not that they only send and receive text, but it's a good assumption to say, if I'm going to deal with any device, that's the minimum ground I have to work with. One of my favorite, and one that I think I wish everybody would just hang up someplace so that they can see it, put it right on your monitor. Users' time and technology belong to them, not to us. We should never take control of either without a really good reason. We should always let the user make the changes necessary, and if at all possible, take advantage of broad technologies that allow us to say, hey, if the user wants to scale fonts, that's up to them. We're not going to force them into a paradigm just because we think it looks cool. So number four, provide good text alternatives for any non-text content. This is a really simple thing to do, especially if you're dealing with web applications, and if you have images, especially featured focal images, include an alt tag or include an ARIA tag that gives a description of what they're looking at, and make the description meaningful. If you happen to have a picture of a 1966 Ford Mustang parked along Ventura Boulevard in Los Angeles, having an alt tag that says car is less than helpful. I mean, at least they know it's a car. But if you describe it as a 1966 Mustang parked on Ventura Boulevard in Los Angeles, even without sight, that can invoke imagery, and it can invoke a sense of context that is much more meaningful. Also, if you do have multiple repeating images that show up as a background or as an element, you can use what are called null tags for them so that they don't get called out. But again, that's a specific design choice, and at least you're making it with awareness. Use widely available technologies to reach your audience. If you focus on a very specific niche technology that has specific commands, and you don't use other options that are readily available, that's going to frustrate your users. And if at all possible, take the time to look at what the options are, and especially if there are relatively universally understood approaches and keystrokes. Use clear language to communicate your message. Use space, use direct words, and as I'll show a little bit later in our tools section, it's possible to be able to make a very high level and educated and well-written description of something and not talk down to people or think, oh, this is so silly. We're dumbing this down to the lowest common denominator. Nope, you're not. You're speaking plainly in a way that more people can understand. Make your sites usable, searchable, and navigable, which means there are a number of key aspects that you can put into your site in regards to using tabs, using keyboard shortcuts, using skip links, which I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail a little bit later. But take the time to make those efforts. Number 8, design your content for semantic meaning and maintain separation between content and presentation. Especially in HTML5 today, there are a number of tags that help you define how you structure your documents. You're no longer limited to just H1 through H5 paragraphs, and the most frustrating wrapper of all, the div. Divs are very difficult to parse. Oftentimes, they're great if you want to create something from scratch and create your own container. However, the challenge with that is it's a pain for assistive devices. You may want to be able to do this really awesome CSS maneuvers to put together this cool 3D shaded button. But honestly, just use the button class because all technologies know what it is. And when you press it, it knows what the response is too. So just consider that a recommendation from my end. Number 9, progressively enhance your basic content by adding extra features. Allow it to degrade gracefully for users who can't or don't wish to use them. Put simply, don't throw it all at them at once. If you're going to enhance for accessibility, don't do this massive overhaul and then say, hey, look, our site is accessible or our app is accessible. Aren't you happy? With so many changes, it's entirely possible that they're going to give you the opposite reaction, as in, no, I'm not happy. I don't know how to use this app anymore. Whereas if you were to introduce a feature one at a time, iteratively, and get them used to it, then by the time you are finished with all of your modifications, the users will be comfortable with using it and know what shortcuts you're using, what keyboard options, etc. And then the last one, number 10, is as you encounter new web technologies, mobile, Internet of Things, fill in the blank, apply these same principles when making them accessible. So I don't like calling out other individuals or other companies. If I'm going to make any recommendations, I'm going to use case studies from things I'm intimately familiar with. I work for a company called Social Text. Social Text makes a wiki, and that wiki allows people to collaborate and communicate. We are now at this point in time part of a couple of broader software products. It's the core engine for a company called PeopleFluent, and PeopleFluent was also recently acquired by a company called LTG in the UK, so it could be integrated with their suite of products. So we exist at a very core level with a lot of other applications. In a sense, you can't really use these products without using Social Text. And so it's very important that Social Text works in a meaningful and easy to navigate way. One of the things that we added a few years ago was the content menu. And if you click on the content menu, what you'll notice is we have this stacking. So we have a create new content option. We have notifications. We have workspaces. recently viewed, and watch list. So workspaces, recently viewed, and watch list are three separate menus. And if you're a sighted user and you have control of a mouse, accessing these is very easy. But if you are a keyboard-only user, our initial implementation of this left a lot to be desired. And it was frustrating to use. And it took a while for us to go through and see what the best way of navigating this drop-down menu option and this 4-set list of abilities was. What we ultimately did was we created custom tags using a technology called WAAEYE. ARIA, by the way, means Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's a ability to add additional comments and additional instructions depending upon the technology. In this case, screen readers, most often, and the screen readers would then give you certain key commands to be able to say, I see you're in the content menu. If you would like to press the Create New Content button, follow this set of commands. And then once you follow them, you can do what you need to. And the workflow would then say, if you wish to go to workspaces, here's the list of items. To interact, enter these commands. Same, if you tab over, this is your recently viewed. If you wish to interact, use these commands. And then it would say, if you want to go up a level, shift tab or something else that would be meaningful to the user that would let them step backwards. Point being, this was something that on the surface looked very simple. It looked like a win-win for everybody, but it took us a little bit of time to get it just right so that it was as usable as it could be by as many people. So again, I'm going to give an additional piece of credit. This mnemonic that I'm going to suggest to you was originally written by Albert Gureyev. He's referenced also in the references for these slides. And that mnemonic is called humble. And so the phrase I use here is practice empathy, be humble, but not just in the physical sense. Humble has specific attributes that I would like for you to remember. So the first one is humanize. In other words, understand the emotional components of people who deal with your product, especially those who have disabilities that they have to deal with that you may not, and try to find a way to understand how they're interacting. Number two, unlearn. So if there are methods that you currently interact with your system, try to do it in a different way. If you're actively someone who uses a mouse, try making your mouse obsolete, like hide it even, so that you only have your keyboard to work with. Because for many unsighted users, that is the reality for them. Everything is done through a keyboard. Model. Use personas that help you see, hear, and feel the issues. It's one thing to be able to say, okay, I understand we have those people who are, who are sight impaired, and they're going to use a screen reader. So if I use a screen reader, that's great. Well, it's a start. But if you really want to understand how your users work, turn off your screen itself. Cover your keyboard. Better yet, take your whole system, find a closet that has no light leakage, and close the door. And sit down with your laptop or your device and try to interact with it in complete darkness. That's a much more telling test. Even then, if you're modeling in that environment and trying to work with them for that purpose, there's one thing you must understand. When you're frustrated or when you're finished dealing with that at that particular point in time, you have the ability to opening the door, going out into the daylight, and seeing again. A sight-impaired user never has that option. So even though we want to say we want to model and use personas for this, they're helpful, but they're never going to be a complete replacement. Build. So build means develop knowledge, testing heuristics, skills, and the ability to be able to do these things. As an example, when you put yourself in literal positions to understand the situation, that's going to help you to develop ideas. These tools should never be used as your only options. They should be used to help you think of new ways of looking at the system and to be able to interact with it. There's always much more you can do. And frankly, if you really want to get the best impression, if you have the ability of working with somebody who is sight impaired or hearing impaired, or is dealing with mobility or cognitive issues, they will be able to give you very valuable feedback. And I suggest that you follow it. And then experiment. Put yourself into, learn. I jumped ahead. What are the barriers? How do users perceive, understand, and operate with our product? And from that, then experiment. And I want to make two plugs. Actually, it's one plug for one organization. It's the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And they have an inclusive design lab. And they also have what's called an inclusive design toolkit. And their toolkit is of two parts, depending upon what you want to get. The first part is a visual toolkit. And they're a set of stacking glasses, paper-rimmed glasses with lenses in them. And the more pairs you stack on, the greater visual impairment you can provide yourself. And you can really see what it's like to use your sight with a progressively and measurable level of sight impairment. The second one, which is a bit more expensive, and but still very, very cool, is that they also make this pair of gloves that you can fit on that go on your fingertips and around your wrist. And they have these strong plastic bands that then run over your fingers and over your knuckles. And you can adjust these to go from fairly fluid movement to very rigid and difficult movement. It's a great empathy exercise. Again, at the end of the day, when you're frustrated with it, you can take them off. Others don't have that option. So I want to talk about a few tools that you can use right here, right now. They are mostly free. They are readily available, and you can get right into understanding and working with accessibility issues right away. So the first one that I want to recommend, you don't have to download anything. It's a website. You can just go right to it. It's called WAAEYE, which stands for Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. Just take whatever site you're interested in looking at and go to waave.webm.org and type the URL for that page in. And what will happen is it will go through and it will process that page, and then it will print out on the sidebar this little summary report that will explain what issues your site may have. And so as you can see right here, again, using just the social text login page, we notice that there are some issues. We have an error. We have alerts. We have 7 features that are implemented. We have structural elements that we have highlighted inside the document. Places where HTML6 and ARIA are being leveraged. And we can also see if there are any contrast errors. So it says here, it looks like we're doing a pretty good job. But we do have one error. What is that error? And the error is up on the very top of the page. We don't, at the time that this was done, we didn't have a skip link for that page. And a skip link, for those who are not familiar with them, are when you tab to, with a screen reader, you can tab to a link. It should usually be the very first link on your document. So once you get to the document page, the very first link it should highlight should say skip to main content. And what that means is if you've got a navigation bar with a lot of menus and a lot of drop downs, and you just want to see the page, by hitting skip to main content and just pressing enter, it bypasses all of that navigational stuff and all the other eye candy pieces, and it goes right to the main text of whatever document is featured in that page or on that app. So I strongly recommend using WebAIM. There is a disadvantage to it, and that disadvantage is you have to load each URL individually. Wave also makes a plugin for certain browsers. It's primarily for the Firefox browser, but you can also download one for Chrome. And that then makes it so that you don't necessarily have to load in the URL every single time. And you can examine pages as you need to. So a second tool, some people like to live inside of the developers tools options when it comes to your browsers. I'm one of those people. And there is a library and a tool that is well suited for this, and it is called Axe. So Axe will allow you to go through, and by using developer tools, you can scan pages and you can look at what the options are that need to be changed. And you can also try them out in real time. So if you change the code and reload the page and rerun Axe, Axe can tell you if, hey, you've fixed this, or this problem is no longer such a big deal, but you got this other issue you could be looking at. Also, for those who run automated tests or want to be able to have this feature in your automated tests, Axe has a library called Axe Core. And Axe Core allows you then to use your favorite testing framework or options or API that you're using, whether you're using Selenium or Water or fill in the blank. By plugging in the Axe Core library, you now have access to all of those options to allow you to test accessibility and check to see if everything is structured the way you want it to be. So one of the most common applications associated with accessibility, and for many it's the only application that they get to use or work with on a regular basis, is a screen reader. If you use a Macintosh computer, you already have VoiceOver built in. There is a very feature-rich and fairly expensive proprietary piece of software called JAWS that is available for Windows PCs, and it is a serious application with a lot of flexibility and a lot of customization for individual users, but it's pricey. It costs anywhere from $500 to $1,000 per seat, depending upon what you're getting. In between, there is an application called NVDA, and NVDA is a open source and free voice application, screen reader, excuse me, and it works for Windows. It's also available for Linux, and that allows you to look at a number of scenarios effectively and use standard controls for being able to drive your screen reader. Remember what I said earlier about not using broadly used technologies? If you're only doing your testing with JAWS, for example, and you're using their preferred proprietary keystroke commands, and other users are using NVDA and you haven't taken the time to set up those options for NVDA, that's going to cause a problem. And that's where I would suggest, if you have to err on the side of caution, err on the side of the most available application. In this case, what does NVDA do? And much of the commands that NVDA does are standard and work with the product in a direct way. One challenge also that we deal with is with color blindness and with color contrast. And as I said earlier, when you get to have these reading glasses when you get older, your color contrast ability also diminishes as you get older. And so there are tools you can use. So there's a color contrast analyzer and the colorblind accessibility extension. Both of these are for Chrome, by the way. And these allow you to go in and take a look and see if your contrast is strong enough, depending upon the level that you are using. So you can select how much of a contrast, whether it's a 3-to-1 or a 7-to-1, and then you can run a mask, and it will show you if you see a breakthrough line here, and it's easy to read and it's easy to recognize what it is, that means that your contrast is sufficient and it's picking it up. Whereas over here, where you see the search pages, docs, people, and science, that's not being picked up. The contrast there is not 3:1. And because of that, you're not going to see it when you run your scan. But this is a quick and easy way to look to see if your main text has enough contrast. And one final gem of a tool that I love using, this tool is called Hemingway. And Hemingway, you can go to hemingwayapp.com, and Hemingway app will load up this simple editor, and you can take text, just a couple of paragraphs or so. The free version limits you to a couple of paragraphs, but that's usually good enough. If you're writing a blog post or if you're putting together technical documentation and you want to see if you are making it as accessible as possible, drop a couple of paragraphs into Hemingway, and it will give you a scorecard. So you can look through and see what are some issues here. So we have adverbs, so we want to maybe have a few less of those. Use of passive voice, definitely go for a more active voice. A phrase has a simpler alternative you can utilize, better to say use. 1 of 11 sentences is hard to read. So we can look to see, is it punctuation? Is it the choice of words? And 1 of 11 sentences is very hard to read. So again, want to go through and see how can I word this differently. And as you do so, by the way, these colors start to disappear. And when you get to a point to where you have no colored listings and no sidebar here, that's going to show you that you've met those requirements and you've probably maximized the ability for users with cognitive impairments to deal with your content as well as they possibly can. Understand, you're not going to be able to meet every situation, but this will maximize your success. You also have a readability level, by the way. The readability level that is encouraged to shoot for is grade 9. Sometimes you're going to have to make choices. If you're dealing with a very technical topic, that may be too limiting. But for most writing, and to put things into layperson's terms, a grade 9 reading level is sufficient and it's appropriate. So aim for that and aim for a clear listing here, and you'll know that you have done the most work possible to make your content as usable by as many people as possible. There's another site that I'd like to encourage people to take a look at. So if you go to the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAAEYE, and just do a search for before and after demonstration. And what it will do is it will show you a typical website, and it shows 2 tabs. It shows a tab for everything that you're communicating with, but it shows an inaccessible image that you can look at, and it shows an accessible version you can look at. Interestingly enough, most people, when they go to the site and they toggle between, if you do it fast enough, you'll see a little bit of pixel dance and a little bit of movement in the elements that you see. But for the most part, you will not really see much of a difference. And this is both the criticism and the highest reason why configuring your products for accessibility and inclusive design is important. Many people will look at these and will say, oh, we did all this accessibility stuff, but if you look at our interface, it looks no different. Nobody notices these changes at all. Well, on the surface, that's true. And therein lies the rub, where you're saying, we made all these accessibility changes and nothing looks different. Well, that's a good thing. Because if you were to say, we made all these accessibility changes and everything looks different and all of our libraries are broken and we can't render our product the way we want to, that's problematic and that's understandable. But if you go and you make these enhancements and say, I don't notice any visible difference, then that means that you have made it possible for normative users to interact with your code the way you want to. But if you've done those accessibility and inclusive design steps, it also means you've made it easier for other people who struggle to be able to interact with the product as well. So I strongly recommend taking a look at this site, and you can actually look at the code underneath and you can see what accessibility options are configured. Usually they're not very extensive. They're just little examples that can be dropped in. And if you create templates for making your pages, no reason not to create those tags in your templates. so that you can take advantage of them. All right. So we're getting to the point where we want to wind down the conversation here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a rapid fire things to think about. So how can you think inclusively? Number one, ensure the images are described with alt tags and that the picture is described meaningfully. Provide a skip link at the top of the document. Use the lang attributes in tags. So if you've got a page that's primarily in English, if you use lang equals English or language equals French or Portuguese, then that automatically tells the system, hey, this page is originally in this language. Do you want to translate it? And you can do what you want to do there. Also, and this is an important thing, if you have text that's quoted in an original language and you want to preserve that quote to the best of your ability, you can inline style and use the language attribute so that it will preserve that. So even if it goes through translations, that language attribute will not automatically be translated. And then they can say, oh, this is a quote that's in French. I'd like to have it translated. And so it only does it once rather than multiple times. And so that's definitely something that you can do, and that helps usability. Make buttons that are scalable, please. Don't tie them to literal images, and don't tie them to divs. Make it so that they are literal buttons and that you can size and shrink. Use images with universal meaning. So a smiley face can be rendered once. No translation is required. As I said before, use the div tag sparingly, especially when you're using a keyboard focus, because if you have multiple divs on a page, it's not going to tell you which one it's looking at. Make content available in a variety of formats. If you're doing an audio podcast and you want to be able to include those that are hearing impaired, include an option that either does live closed captioning or create a transcript so that they can read it. Allow for multiple ways to enter the date. This is my personal biggest frustration. And I've said it's as rare. It's as rare as water in a desert. Date pickers can be very challenging in the sense that if you have to go in and select it with a mouse, it's a very difficult thing to maneuver with a keyboard. If you just put in a text box underneath so that people can actually type in the month, date, and year, it's a huge win. And it's a very minor tweak. Yet it's one of those issues I run across with frequently on sites and in apps. So I strongly encourage, if you do nothing else, you want to really make some people's days, if you have dates that you have to manipulate in your app, put a text box in there. Seriously, I think you'll be surprised at the positive feedback you receive. Allow pinch to zoom to let users determine the amount of zoom and focus needed to review a page. I would add to that if at all possible, if your application and your system allows for accessibility options set at the macro level, like at the control panel level, leverage those. Work with it so that if your user sets their font sizes or their screen size to a certain method to be most visible, allow it. Don't say, well, we're only going to format it this way, otherwise it's going to mess up the look of the page. Yeah, it might. But I think for many users, they want your content. They don't necessarily care if it's pretty at that given moment. And encourage the use of proportional fonts. Comes down to the same thing. Make sure that they can be resized easily and let the user make that decision. Write simply. Use space. Use high contrast designs. This is one that also for some people, staring at a screen that is shining back at them is very taxing. Many people, even today, still print off stuff to be able to read it. So if you've got elements on a page you want to make sure are there, make sure that you print them as well. And simple interfaces are usable interfaces. Don't make navigation or discovery more difficult than it has to be. Finally, with the tools that you use while you're doing your testing, a favorite phrase I use for this, it's also my phrase when it comes to automation, tools cannot make judgment calls. They can identify an issue, they can assert what's known, and if it doesn't match, they can tell you that. They can confirm the presence of tags if you're looking for saying, is a site accessible? Well, I can tell you if a tag exists or doesn't. But a tool is never going to be able to say, is this experience for a sight-impaired user comparable to what a normatively sight user is experiencing? That's something a human has to do. And tools cannot determine if it is appropriate for the person in question. So to summarize, the farther along a product gets in its development, the more difficult it is to modify it. If you're going to go with inclusive design, strongly encourage that you do it early in your product development. You can do it later, but it's going to be more difficult. Inclusive design helps make last mile modifications that much easier to implement. And think of yourself in the future with the possibility that many of the disabilities that have been mentioned, or possibly all of them, may become part of your everyday experience. As I gave a talk in Portland last week, I said, future-proof your software. But I don't mean future-proof it technologically. I mean future-proof it anthropologically. Make it so that you can use it. Not everyone is the same as you. Practice empathy and think about the future, because you may be the one that benefits most from these design changes. And that wraps up my general presentation. I have some references here that I strongly encourage people to look at. I will also make these slides available to any who want them, and we will get those to all who are participating. That's my contact information, and I turn the time back to our facilitators.